Hi everyone, this is Sarfraz from Aristotle Prep, and we are looking at passage 5 from the OG 13 RC chapter. This has questions 14 to 17. So we will first read the passage. I will explain to you what I've understood, and then we will proceed to the questions. So the first sentence of the passage is always very important. It says, when Jamaican-born social activist Marcus Garvey came to the US in 1916, he arrived at precisely the right historical moment. So now I'm curious to know why was it the right historical moment. So it goes on to say what made the moment right was the return of African American soldiers from the First World War in 1918, which created an ideal constituency for someone with Garvey's message of unity, pride, and improved conditions for African American communities. So the first paragraph basically talks about this person, Marcus Garvey, who is talking about or who is advocating about the pride and other unity, improved conditions for African Americans. And the people who are listening to him primarily are the African American soldiers who've just come back from the First World War. That's basically the first paragraph for me. Second paragraph, the first sentence says, hoping to participate in the traditional American ethos of individual success, many African American people entered the armed forces with enthusiasm only to find themselves segregated from white troops and subjected to numerous indignities. The first sentence itself tells me that these people, these African American soldiers who've come back are not happy because they had gone into the war hoping for equality, but they were still segregated or discriminated. They returned to a US that was as segregated as it had been before the war. Considering similar experiences, anthropologist Anthony F.C. Wallace has argued that when a perceptible gap arises between a culture's expectations and the reality of that culture, the resulting tension can inspire a revitalization movement, an organized, conscious effort to construct a culture that fulfills long-standing expectations. So in the second paragraph, basically we are told that these African American soldiers are a disappointed lot because even after they came back from the war, they are still being discriminated against. And this particular anthropologist has put forward a theory that when such large-scale discrimination happens, then the time is right for a new movement to start. Something like that. Whether it started or not, I have no idea. The last paragraph says, some scholars have argued that Garvey created the consciousness from which he built in 1920s the largest revitalization movement in African American history. So now I know that the movement definitely did start. Garvey did start the movement, the revitalization movement. But such an argument only tends to obscure the consciousness of identity, strength, and sense of history that already existed in the African American community. Okay, what did it say then? So the first sentence says, some scholars have argued that Garvey created the consciousness, okay. And the second one says, but such an argument tends to obscure or hide the consciousness of identity, this, that already existed. So now the issue is whether Garvey created it or whether such consciousness already existed. Garvey did not create this consciousness, rather he gave this consciousness its political expression. Okay, great. And this is, by the way, the author of the passage speaking. So the author of the passage in the last paragraph says, some scholars believe that Garvey created this revitalization movement, but the author of the passage believes that Garvey did not create this consciousness, he only helped express it properly. So that is the entire passage for us. It talks about this social activist Marcus Garvey and how he started a movement basically for equality of rights for African Americans, and how the African American soldiers who've come back from the World War were eager to listen to him and to follow whatever he was advocating. If I think about the purpose, I don't think it's a positive or a negative passage. It's mostly a neutral passage. Mostly a neutral passage. The reason I say that is because in the end, in the absolute last paragraph, the author does make one small point, which is that Garvey did not create this consciousness, he only expressed it. But that's not either speaking in favor or against anything. Maybe speaking against those scholars in the last paragraph, but overall I think the passage is definitely a neutral passage. With that thought process, we will now look at the questions. So question number 14 says, according to the passage, which means it's a detailed question, according to the passage, which of the following contributed to Marcus Garvey's success? One thing that comes to my mind is what contributed to his success is that people were very eager to listen to him, those soldiers who had come back. So let's look at the options. A says, he introduced cultural and historical consciousness to the African American community. It's actually debatable whether he introduced or not in the last paragraph, so out. B says, he believed enthusiastically in the traditional American ethos, has got nothing to do with the answer. C says, his audience had already formed a consciousness that made it receptive to his message. Looks good, hold on to it. D says, his message appealed to critics of African American support for US military involvement in the First World War. No such thing is mentioned in the passage. E says, he supported the movement to protest segregation that had emerged prior to his arrival. No, absolutely not. The reason for success, as we predicted, is that people were willing to listen to him, which is what option C says, and that should be absolutely the correct answer for us.